Just a housewife who keeps me organized. My husband Arnold laughed while I stood beside him at his company's annual awards dinner, holding his forgotten speech notes like the devoted wife I'd trained myself to be. The regional manager, Patrick, raised his eyebrows with obvious amusement. Interesting perspective from someone whose wife just acquired controlling interest in the entire corporation. The ballroom fell silent as 200 employees turned to stare. I stepped forward to the microphone, smoothing my simple black dress. Actually, it's former wife. Divorce papers were signed this afternoon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Oh, and Arnold, security will escort you out. Your executive parking space has been reassigned. His champagne glass slipped from his trembling fingers as I smiled. Next time, maybe read the fine print on those investment documents you've been signing. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Hotel cast golden light across Harbor Industries' most prestigious annual event, but all I could see was Arnold's familiar smirk as he dismissed me to the most important client of his career. 20 minutes of highway driving to deliver forgotten speech notes, only to become his entertainment. "This is Esme," Arnold announced to Patrick Kellerman, the regional manager from Seattle. "Just a housewife who keeps me organized." The casual cruelty made my cheeks burn as I clutched those notes, the same ones he'd frantically called me to bring after leaving them on our kitchen counter. Patrick's eyebrows lifted slightly, but Arnold wasn't finished. "Don't mind her. She likes to pretend she understands business, but—" He shrugged, letting the implication hang in the expensive air like sour perfume. Around us, conversations continued, but I caught the sideways glances, the barely concealed smiles of colleagues who'd witnessed this performance countless times before. Stood there in my target dress, chosen because Arnold once said it made me look appropriate for corporate functions. Feeling 200 pairs of eyes treating me exactly as my husband had trained them to, as an accessory, a minor character, in his success story. The speech notes suddenly felt like evidence of my own diminishment, but Patrick wasn't smiling. Instead, he studied me with an expression between recognition and respect. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that made nearby conversations falter. Interesting perspective from someone whose wife just acquired controlling interest in the entire corporation. The words landed like thunder. Arnold's confidence cracked, confusion replacing arrogance as he looked between Patrick and me. The regional manager's announcement wasn't supposed to happen until after dinner, wasn't supposed to include details that would make this moment so perfectly devastating. Something shifted inside me. A door slamming shut on 12 years of accepting less. The woman who'd driven across town to deliver forgotten notes was disappearing, replaced by someone I'd kept hidden too long. "Actually," I said, stepping forward to claim space I'd been denied, "it's former wife. The divorce papers were signed this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Arnold's face went ashen. Around us, Harbor Industries' elite stood frozen, champagne suspended halfway to lips, witnessing the complete inversion of everything they thought they understood. "Oh, and Arnold?" I continued, smoothing my target dress with finally steady hands. "Security will be escorting you out this evening. Your executive parking space has been reassigned to someone more suitable for the position." His champagne glass slipped, crystals shattering against marble in a sound that echoed through the vast ballroom. 12 years of marriage, 8 years of systematic professional diminishment, countless humiliating moments where I'd been just something, all crystallized in this single moment of absolute reversal. "This is impossible," Arnold whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. Somewhere in his mind, he was connecting dots he'd been too arrogant to notice. Legal documents signed without reading, investment opportunities dismissed, phone calls assumed social when they were strategic. I smiled. The same smile I'd perfected, at corporate events where I'd been decorative background, but now carrying different weight entirely. "Next time, Arnold, I said loud enough for every employee to hear. Maybe read the fine print on those investment documents you've been signing. Patrick began clapping, slowly at first, then with enthusiasm. One by one, employees joined in, recognizing a power shift when they saw one. The applause built into something thunderous, washing over me like validation I'd been starving for. But this moment was just the visible tip of an iceberg forming for months, built from careful planning, strategic thinking, and business acumen. Arnold had spent years dismissing as cute when I'd tried contributing to his conversations. The truth was, it hadn't always been like this. There was a time when Arnold respected my mind, sought my advice, when we were partners in every sense. But that felt like a lifetime ago, buried under years of systematic diminishment so gradual, I'd almost convinced myself it was normal. Almost. Standing in the Grand Meridian's ballroom, surrounded by shocked faces, I finally understood this moment wasn't my story's end. It was the beginning. The drive home from the Grand Meridian felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold through the windshield of my modest Honda Civic. My hands gripped the steering wheel with the same intensity I'd used to hold Arnold's speech notes just hours earlier, but everything had changed. The woman who'd rushed across town to save her husband from embarrassment no longer existed. I pulled into our driveway, my driveway now, legally speaking, and sat in the darkness for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The colonial-style house we'd bought 8 years ago looked exactly the same under the porch light's warm glow, but I felt like an alien visiting a place that had once been home. Through the kitchen window, I could see the counter where Arnold had left his forgotten speech notes. The same granite surface where I'd spent countless mornings preparing his coffee exactly how he liked it, while he scrolled through emails that apparently included documents signing away his future. Inside, the silence felt different. Not peaceful, expectant. I kicked off the uncomfortable heels I'd worn to look appropriate and padded barefoot across the hardwood floors Arnold had insisted on installing 3 years ago. Investment in resale value, he'd explained as if I didn't understand basic economics. Now I wondered how many other decisions he'd made while assuming I wouldn't comprehend the implications. The papers were exactly where I'd left them on my desk in the spare bedroom, the room Arnold had designated as Esme's craft space, when we'd moved in, as if my MBA from Northwestern and 8 years of investment banking experience could be reduced to scrapbooking and Pinterest projects. The merger documents, acquisition reports, and financial projections spread across the antique writing desk told a different story entirely. I poured myself a glass of wine, the good wine, the bottle Arnold had been saving for when we had something to celebrate, and began mentally cataloging the moments that had led to tonight's reversal. The humiliation at the awards dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to diminish me that had been so subtle, so expertly executed, that I'd nearly convinced myself it was normal. When had I stopped? Correcting people who assumed I'd never worked outside the home? When had I accepted being introduced as Arnold's wife instead of by my own name? When had I begun to believe that my contributions to our conversations about his work were cute, rather than informed? The answer came flooding back with uncomfortable clarity. It started the day I'd made the mistake of suggesting a strategy that proved more successful than Arnold's original plan. 3 years ago, Harbor Industries had been struggling with a hostile takeover attempt from Meridian Corp. Arnold had come home frustrated after weeks of failed negotiations, and I'd listened as he outlined their defensive strategy over dinner. Having worked on similar cases during my investment banking days, I'd casually mentioned an alternative approach, a leverage buyout structure that could turn the tables entirely. "That's interesting, honey," Arnold had said with that patronizing smile I'd grown to recognize. "But these things are pretty complex. The board has hired the best consultants money can buy." But I'd seen the spark in his eyes, the way he'd suddenly straightened in his chair. 2 weeks later, Harbor Industries announced a revolutionary defensive strategy that bore a remarkable resemblance to my dinner table suggestion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Arnold had been promoted to senior vice president. At the celebration party, when colleagues praised his innovative thinking, he'd simply smiled and accepted the credit. That should have been my first warning. Instead, I'd been proud of him. I'd convinced myself that my contribution had been minor, that Arnold's execution and presentation were what really mattered. I'd even felt grateful that he'd listened to me at all, pathetic as that seemed now. Looking back, I could trace the pattern with devastating clarity. Every subsequent suggestion I'd made had been met with increasing dismissal, but somehow, variations of my ideas kept appearing in Arnold's presentations. When I'd pointed out the similarities, he'd laughed it off. "Great minds think alike," he'd say. Or, "You must have absorbed some of my strategic thinking over the years." The truly insidious part was how he'd made me complicit in my own erasure. He'd started asking me to review his presentations, ostensibly for clarity and flow, but really to mine them for improvements he could claim as his own insights. I'd been flattered by his trust, honored that he valued my opinion enough to seek my input. What a fool I'd been. The wine was making me bold, or maybe just honest with myself for the first time in years. I walked to the bathroom mirror and studied the woman looking back at me. 42 years old, intelligent, accomplished, reduced to playing the role of supportive housewife in someone else's success story. When had I stopped wearing the sharp business suits that made me feel powerful? When had I traded my briefcase for a canvas tote bag filled with Arnold's dry cleaning receipts and grocery lists? When had I accepted that my worth was measured by how well I anticipated his needs, rather than how effectively I could analyze market trends or structure complex financial deals? The breaking point hadn't been tonight's humiliation, I realized. That had been the moment of recognition, the catalyst that forced me to see what I'd been ignoring for years. The real breaking point had happened months ago, in my own kitchen, when I'd overheard Arnold on a phone call with his colleague Garrett. "Esme?" Arnold had laughed, thinking I was upstairs folding laundry. "She's got some ideas, sure, but you know how wives are. They watch too much CNBC and think they understand business." I just nod and smile. Keeps her happy. I'd stood frozen in the hallway, basket of his freshly ironed shirts in my arms, listening to my husband of 12 years dismiss my Northwestern MBA and 8 years of Wall Street experience as the naive enthusiasm of a bored housewife who watched too much television. That was the moment I'd started planning. 15 years ago, I was Esme Richardson, the youngest vice president in Goldman Sachs's Mergers and Acquisitions division, and I owned every room I walked into. My corner office on the 32nd floor overlooked Manhattan's financial district, and my business cards didn't need explanations or qualifications, just my name, title, and direct line. I'd earned that position by closing deals that senior partners twice my age couldn't crack. The Hartwell Industries restructuring, the Morrison Tech merger that everyone said was impossible, the pharmaceutical acquisition that required navigating regulatory mazes in 3 different countries. My success wasn't luck or connections. It was pure analytical firepower combined with an instinct for seeing opportunities that others missed. That's where I met Arnold Mitchell, though he wasn't the man who would later dismiss me as just a housewife at company parties. Back then, he was a rising star at Harbor Industries, smart and ambitious, with an infectious laugh and genuine respect for my expertise. We met during the coastal manufacturing acquisition. Harbor Industries was the buyer, Goldman Sachs was representing the seller, and I was the lead on our team. "You're Esme Richardson," he'd said during our first meeting, extending his hand with a smile that seemed both professional and genuinely impressed. "I read your analysis of the semiconductor market consolidation. Brilliant work. I remember being struck by how he looked directly at me when he spoke. not past me toward my male colleagues like so many clients did. Arnold had done his homework. He referenced specific points from my published research, asked intelligent follow-up questions, treated me like the expert I was rather than an obstacle to navigate around. The coastal manufacturing deal took 6 months to close, involving complex regulatory approvals and intricate financial restructuring. Arnold and I worked closely throughout the process, often staying late in conference rooms filled with documents and takeout containers, solving problems that would have stumped less experienced teams. "How do you see it so clearly?" he asked, one evening as we worked through a particularly complex tax implication. We'd been at it for 12 hours straight, and I'd just identified a structure that would save both companies millions in regulatory fees. "Pattern recognition," I explained, pointing to the financial models spread across the table. "Most people see numbers. I see relationships, dependencies, opportunities. It's like reading a story where the plot points are buried in spreadsheets." Arnold had leaned back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's remarkable. I've never heard anyone explain it that way." What I didn't realize then was that Arnold wasn't just impressed by my analytical skills. He was studying them, learning from them, absorbing my methodologies in ways that would later allow him to replicate my thinking without acknowledging its source. But in those early days, our professional relationship felt like genuine partnership. When Harbor Industries needed creative financing solutions, Arnold would call my direct line. When I was working on deals in his industry, I'd bounce ideas off him during long dinners at expensive Manhattan restaurants. "You should consider leaving Goldman," he suggested one night over wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Someone with your strategic mind could revolutionize a company like Harbor Industries. We're growing fast, but we need innovative thinking at the executive level." I'd laughed, not dismissively, but because the idea seemed so unlikely. "I love what I do, Arnold. Wall Street is exactly where I belong." "Is it, though?" He'd leaned forward, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that would later become so familiar. "You're brilliant at seeing the big picture, but you're implementing other people's visions. What if you could be the one setting strategy instead of just executing it?" The seed was planted, but it took another year to germinate. During that time, Arnold and I transitioned from professional colleagues to something more personal. He'd visit New York every few weeks, always with legitimate business reasons, but increasingly motivated by our growing relationship. Arnold was different from the Wall Street men I usually dated. He wasn't trying to compete with my career or prove his own worth by diminishing mine. Instead, he seemed genuinely fascinated by my work, asking detailed questions about deal structures and market analysis. He'd remember specifics from conversations weeks earlier, referencing my insights in ways that made me feel truly heard. "You know what I love about you?" he said during one of our weekend trips to the Hamptons. We were walking along the beach, and I was explaining why I thought the telecommunications sector was ripe for consolidation. "You don't just understand business, you understand it better than anyone I've met, including most of the senior executives at Harbor." That was Arnold's greatest talent, I realized later, making me feel exceptional while simultaneously suggesting that my current situation didn't fully appreciate my worth. It was a seductive combination for someone who'd spent years proving herself, in rooms full of men who questioned her competence. When Harbor Industries offered me the position of Chief Strategy Officer 18 months later, it felt like destiny. Arnold had been promoted to Vice President of Operations, and the company was expanding aggressively into new markets. They needed someone with my background to guide their growth strategy. "Think about it," Arnold had said over dinner at our favorite restaurant in Midtown. "Goldman will always see you as talented employee. At Harbor, you could be the architect of something transformational." The offer was substantial, not quite Goldman money, but close enough, with equity options that could be incredibly valuable if the company continued growing. More importantly, it represented something I'd never had on Wall Street: The opportunity to build strategy from the ground up, rather than simply executing deals designed by others. We'd be partners, Arnold had added, though we weren't even engaged yet. Your strategic vision, my operational experience. We could transform Harbor Industries into something unprecedented. I gave Goldman Sachs 6 weeks' notice and moved to Chicago with the confidence of someone who'd never failed at anything she'd attempted. My farewell party was attended by managing directors who predicted I'd be running a Fortune 500 company within a decade. You're making the right choice, my mentor Sarah had told me as we shared a final drink at our usual spot near the office. Just remember, never let anyone make you smaller than you are. That's the only way brilliant women lose in business. I'd laughed, unable to imagine anyone successfully diminishing my professional presence. After 8 years of thriving in one of the world's most competitive environments, I felt invincible. Harbor Industries welcomed me with the fanfare reserved for transformational hires. My first strategy presentation to the board received a standing ovation. Arnold beamed with pride from across the conference room, and I felt like we were building something magnificent together. My initial months exceeded every expectation. I identified 3 acquisition targets that would expand Harbor's market share by 40%. I restructured their supply chain to reduce costs while improving quality metrics. I developed partnerships with overseas manufacturers that positioned the company for international expansion. Arnold and I made a formidable team, or so I thought. He'd implement my strategic recommendations with precision, and his operational expertise would strengthen my market analyses. Colleagues described us as the dynamic duo, the perfect combination of visionary thinking and practical execution. When Arnold proposed on the anniversary of my joining Harbor Industries, it felt like the culmination of both personal and professional dreams. We were building a life together while building a company together, and I couldn't imagine anything more satisfying than that kind of integrated success. To partnerships, Arnold toasted at our engagement party, raising his glass toward mine. In every sense of the word, I should have paid more attention to the way he phrased that toast, the subtle implication that our professional collaboration was somehow equivalent to our personal relationship. But I was too happy, too confident in my own abilities, too trusting in his respect for my contributions. The woman who'd conquered Wall Street assumed she could handle anything. She had no idea what was coming. Our first 2 years of marriage felt like a masterclass in professional synergy. Arnold and I didn't just work for the same company. We operated as a unified strategic force that transformed Harbor Industries from a regional manufacturing firm into a nationally competitive corporation. Every morning began with coffee in our kitchen while we reviewed the day's priorities, sharing insights and challenges with the easy collaboration of people who genuinely respected each other's expertise. Arnold would outline operational concerns while I analyzed market implications, and together we'd develop solutions that neither of us could have reached independently. The Portland facility is running at 87% capacity, Arnold mentioned one Tuesday morning, stirring cream into his coffee while I reviewed overnight commodity reports on my tablet. We're going to hit a bottleneck within 3 months if orders keep increasing at this rate. I pulled up Harbor's regional distribution analysis, my mind already calculating possibilities. What if we restructured the supply chain to redirect overflow to the Denver facility? They're only at 60% capacity, and transportation costs would actually decrease if we rerouted through Kansas City. Arnold leaned over to study my tablet screen, his expression shifting from concern to excitement as he traced the logistics I was outlining. That's brilliant. We could increase overall efficiency by 12% while solving the capacity problem. How fast could we implement? This was how we operated in those golden days. Seamless collaboration where my strategic thinking complemented his operational expertise. Arnold never questioned my analysis or suggested that complex logistics were beyond my understanding. Instead, he'd build on my ideas, strengthen them with his practical knowledge, and together we'd present solutions to Harbor's board that consistently exceeded expectations. The Midwest expansion project became our signature achievement. Harbor industries had been struggling to compete with larger manufacturers who dominated the regional market, but I'd identified an opportunity in emerging automotive technologies that required specialized components nobody else was producing efficiently. The electric vehicle market is about to explode, I explained during one of our evening strategy sessions in Arnold's home office. We'd spread charts and market projections across every available surface, our dinner growing cold while we worked through the possibilities. Traditional manufacturers are scrambling to retool, but they're thinking about adapting existing processes. We could build entirely new facilities designed specifically for these components. Arnold studied the financial models I'd developed, asking insightful questions about capital requirements and timeline projections. The investment would be massive, he said, but his tone suggested intrigue rather than skepticism. We'd need board approval for expenditures this size. The ROI projections justify it, I replied, highlighting the relevant sections. Conservative estimates show break-even within 18 months, with potential for 40% profit margins by year 3. And that's assuming modest market growth. If electric vehicle adoption accelerates even slightly faster than current projections, we could be looking at monopolistic advantages. That night, we worked until 3 a.m, refining the proposal until it was bulletproof. Arnold contributed operational insights that made my market analysis more practical, while I provided financial frameworks that transformed his production ideas into compelling investment opportunities. When we presented the Midwest expansion to Harbor's board 2 weeks later, the response was immediate and unanimous approval. The presentation lasted 90 minutes, with Arnold and I alternating seamlessly between strategic overview and operational details. Board members asked challenging questions about market risks and implementation timelines, but we'd anticipated every concern and had data-driven responses prepared. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking Harbor Industries needs, declared Roberta Stone, the board's most demanding member and a former executive at Fortune 500 manufacturing companies. The analysis is thorough, the projections are realistic, and the strategic vision positions us ahead of industry trends rather than chasing them. After the meeting, Arnold and I celebrated at our favorite restaurant, sharing a bottle of champagne and marveling at how perfectly our different strengths had combined to create something neither of us could have achieved alone. "We make an incredible team," Arnold said, raising his glass toward mine. "Your strategic brilliance and my operational experience, it's like we were designed to work together." I felt the same way. Marriage had enhanced rather than complicated our professional relationship, creating a partnership where trust and mutual respect allowed us to take risks and pursue opportunities that would have been impossible independently. This Midwest expansion project exceeded every projection. Within 6 months, our new facilities were operating at full capacity with waiting lists for specialized components that competitors couldn't manufacture efficiently. Harbor's stock price increased by 38%, and industry publications featured articles about our innovative approach to emerging market opportunities. Arnold was promoted to Senior Vice President of Operations, and I was offered the newly created position of Executive Vice President of Strategic Development. We were Harbor Industries' youngest executives in company history, and our success was attributed to what business journals called unprecedented strategic operational integration. But our partnership extended beyond professional achievements. Arnold genuinely valued my perspective on decisions both large and small. When Harbor considered acquiring a smaller firm in Ohio, he'd seek my assessment of cultural fit and financial implications. When I developed market entry strategies for international expansion, he'd provide practical insights about manufacturing constraints and regulatory requirements. "What do you think about the European market timing?" he asked one evening as we reviewed expansion possibilities. We were in our living room, laptops open and documents scattered across the coffee table, working together as naturally as breathing. "The regulatory environment is stabilizing," I replied, pulling up comparative analyses I'd been developing. "If we enter now, we'll establish market presence before larger competitors commit resources. But we need local partnerships to navigate compliance requirements effectively." Arnold nodded, making notes about potential manufacturing partners while I outlined financial structuring options. This was our rhythm: collaborative, respectful, genuinely collaborative in ways that made both of us more effective than we'd ever been individually. Our colleagues often commented on our professional dynamic, describing us as Harbor Industries' secret weapon. During strategy meetings, Arnold would reference my market research while I'd incorporate his operational insights, creating presentations that addressed every concern from multiple perspectives. "It's like watching a perfectly choreographed dance," our colleague Isabel mentioned after a particularly successful client presentation. "You anticipate each other's points, strengthen each other's arguments, never compete for attention or credit." She was right. Competition never occurred to us because we weren't in competition. We were building something together that benefited from both of our contributions equally. Arnold's success enhanced my strategic initiatives, while my market insights made his operational improvements more impactful. When Harbor Industries was featured on the cover of Manufacturing Today, with the headline, "Strategic Innovation: How Partnership Drives Growth," the accompanying article highlighted our collaborative approach as a model for executive leadership. "The Mitchell Partnership represents a new paradigm in corporate leadership," the journalist wrote. "Rather than competing for individual recognition, they've created a collaborative dynamic that amplifies both strategic vision and operational excellence." Arnold framed that article and hung it in his office, pointing it out proudly when colleagues visited. I kept my copy in my briefcase, occasionally rereading it during business trips when I needed reminding of what professional partnership could accomplish. Those were the days when I felt invincible, when every challenge seemed manageable because Arnold and I could tackle it together. I'd found my perfect professional complement, someone who enhanced my strengths while covering my weaknesses, and who seemed to feel the same way about my contributions to his success. Looking back now, I wonder if those golden days were real, or if I'd constructed them from selective memory and wishful thinking. But I don't think so. The business results were too concrete, the mutual respect too consistent, the collaboration too natural to have been entirely manufactured. What I didn't understand then was how quickly partnership could transform into something else entirely. How respect could evolve into patronization so gradually that I wouldn't notice until it was too late. How the man who once valued my strategic brilliance could convince himself, and eventually me, that my contributions had been less significant than they actually were, but that transformation was still months away. In those early days of marriage and professional collaboration, Arnold and I were genuinely building something magnificent together. Neither of us realized that only one of us would ultimately be allowed to take credit for it. The changes began, so subtly that I initially dismissed them as coincidences or misunderstandings. 3 months after my promotion to Executive Vice President of Strategic Development, I started noticing small shifts in how Arnold presented our collaborative work to others. It began with language. During board presentations, Arnold's descriptions of our joint projects gradually evolved from Esme and I developed, to we developed, to eventually just I developed. The shift was so gradual that I barely registered it consciously, but something in my subconscious began keeping track. The European market entry strategy leveraged insights from our operational assessment, Arnold explained to the board during our quarterly review. I sat beside him, nodding along, even though the European analysis had been entirely my work while Arnold had focused on domestic capacity issues. When I mentioned the misattribution afterward, Arnold seemed genuinely confused. "Of course you did the European analysis," he said, that charming smile reassuring me that I was overreacting. When I said our operational assessment, I meant the combined work we both contributed to. You're being too literal, honey. I accepted that explanation because it seemed reasonable, and because Arnold's tone suggested that my concern was slightly petty. Looking back, I recognize this as the first instance of a pattern that would become devastatingly familiar. My accuracy, being reframed as oversensitivity. The second shift involved meeting attendance. Arnold began scheduling quick strategic discussions with senior leadership during times when I had other commitments. These weren't formal meetings, he explained, just informal brainstorming sessions that didn't require my presence. Garrett wanted to bounce some ideas around about the Southeast expansion, Arnold mentioned casually one evening after I'd missed a gathering in his office while attending a client presentation. Nothing formal, just exploring possibilities. But when the Southeast expansion proposal appeared on the next board agenda, it bore a striking resemblance to strategies I'd outlined in previous discussions with Arnold. When I asked about the similarities, he seemed genuinely pleased. "Great minds think alike," he said, kissing my cheek affectionately. "I must be absorbing some of your strategic thinking through osmosis. Isn't it wonderful how married couples start thinking similarly?" Again, his explanation seemed logical, even flattering. I was proud that my analytical approach was influencing his thinking. It felt like evidence of our deep partnership rather than something more concerning. The third shift was more obvious, but somehow easier to rationalize. Arnold started asking me to handle what he called communication support during important presentations, preparing materials, coordinating logistics, managing follow-up items while he focused on high-level strategic discussions. "You're so much better at the detail work," he explained when I questioned why I was suddenly responsible for distributing presentation materials instead of co-presenting. "Your organizational skills free me up to focus on the bigger picture, items that require operational expertise." I wanted to object that strategic development was my area of expertise, not operational management, but Arnold's reasoning seemed practical. Someone did need to handle logistics, and if Arnold was better at fielding operational questions during presentations, perhaps it made sense for me to focus on supporting roles. What I didn't realize then was how quickly communication support would evolve into broader administrative responsibilities. Within weeks, I was proofreading Arnold's presentations, scheduling his meetings with senior staff, and handling follow-up communications with board members about strategic initiatives I'd originally developed. "Could you send Roberta the revised market analysis?" Arnold would ask, referring to work that had been entirely my research and conclusions. She had some questions about the methodology. I'd send the analysis with a brief note explaining the research approach, but Arnold would handle the follow-up conversations. Gradually, board members began associating the strategic insights with Arnold's explanations, rather than my original research. The most insidious change involved credit attribution. During casual conversations, Arnold developed a habit of referring to insights I had, or strategies I developed, when discussing work that had originated from my analysis. These weren't formal presentations where precision mattered, just informal conversations with colleagues, so correcting him seemed unnecessarily pedantic. The automotive market analysis was fascinating, our colleague Patrick mentioned during a company lunch. "Arnold, your prediction about electric vehicle component demand was incredibly prescient." I opened my mouth to clarify that the automotive analysis had been my project, but Arnold was already responding. "Thanks, Patrick. It required some deep dive research into emerging technologies, but the patterns were definitely there for anyone paying attention. Anyone paying attention." The phrase stung because I'd been the one paying attention, spending weeks analyzing patent filings and regulatory trends while Arnold focused on production scheduling. But correcting him in front of Patrick seemed petty, especially since Arnold wasn't technically claiming exclusive credit, just accepting praise without redirect. These incidents accumulated slowly, each one individually minor, but collectively creating a pattern I was only beginning to recognize. My role in our collaborative work was being quietly minimized through language choices and meeting dynamics that seemed natural, but somehow always resulted in Arnold receiving disproportionate recognition. The most troubling aspect wasn't Arnold's behavior. It was my own response. I found myself accepting explanations that didn't quite make sense, prioritizing harmony over accuracy, and gradually internalizing the idea that my contributions were somehow less significant than I'd originally believed. "You seem stressed lately," Arnold observed one evening as I reviewed quarterly reports in our home office. "Maybe you're taking work too seriously. Remember, we're partners in this. My success is your success." His concern seemed genuine, and his logic was technically correct. We were partners, and Arnold's professional advancement did benefit our household. But something about the framing troubled me. The implication that his individual recognition somehow represented our joint success, while my individual contributions were just components of his broader achievements. By our third year of marriage, the erosion of my professional identity had accelerated beyond what could be explained by coincidence or miscommunication. What had started as subtle language shifts had evolved into systematic exclusion from decisions I'd previously been central to making. The Pacific Coast Expansion project became the clearest example of how completely my role had been redefined. I'd spent months developing market penetration strategies for California and Oregon, analyzing regulatory requirements, and identifying potential manufacturing partners. My research showed that harbor industries could capture significant market share by entering before larger competitors committed resources to the region. "This is groundbreaking analysis," Arnold said after reviewing my preliminary findings. "The competitive landscape assessment alone could revolutionize how we approach new markets." I felt vindicated by his enthusiasm, especially since the Pacific Coast project represented exactly the kind of strategic thinking harbor industries had hired me to provide. The analysis required expertise in market dynamics, regulatory compliance, and financial modeling, all areas where my background exceeded anyone else's at the company. But when Arnold scheduled the board presentation to discuss West Coast expansion, I wasn't included in the planning meetings. Instead, I received an email from his assistant requesting that I compile supporting materials and prepare handouts for distribution. "I thought we'd be presenting together," I mentioned to Arnold over dinner the night before the board meeting. The Pacific Coast analysis was my project. Arnold looked up from his phone with an expression of mild surprise, as if my expectation was somehow unreasonable. "Of course it was your analysis, sweetheart. But you know how board presentations work. They prefer single-point communication. For complex strategic initiatives, having multiple presenters can confuse the message." His explanation sounded logical, but something about it felt wrong. I'd co-presented to the board dozens of times during our early collaborative period, and members had always appreciated hearing different perspectives on complex projects. Had that preference supposedly changed? Wouldn't they benefit from hearing directly from the person who did the research? I pressed gently. Arnold set down his phone and reached across the table to take my hand, his voice taking on the patient tone usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to children. "Esme, I understand you're proud of the work. You should be. But board presentations aren't about individual recognition. They're about presenting strategic recommendations in the most effective way possible." The implication stung, that my desire to present my own work was about ego rather than expertise. Arnold had successfully reframed my professional competence as personal vanity, making it difficult to object without seeming petty or self-absorbed. The next morning, I sat in the boardroom while Arnold presented my Pacific Coast analysis as if it were his own strategic insight. He'd memorized my research thoroughly, presenting market data and regulatory findings with confidence that suggested intimate familiarity with every detail. "The competitive timing is crucial," Arnold explained to the board, clicking through slides I'd created. Our analysis shows a narrow window for market entry before larger manufacturers establish regional dominance. Our analysis. The phrase should have provided some comfort, but Arnold's delivery made it clear that our referred to Harbor Industries collectively, rather than any specific collaboration between us. I'd become invisible even when my work was being discussed, directly. When board members asked detailed questions about regulatory compliance and market penetration strategies, Arnold answered confidently using frameworks I'd developed. His responses were accurate because they were based on my research, but the depth of his knowledge impressed board members who assumed he'd personally conducted the analysis. "Excellent strategic thinking, Arnold," Roberta commented after the presentation. "This level of market analysis represents exactly the kind of competitive advantage Harbor Industries needs." I felt physically sick listening to praise for my work being directed toward someone else, but speaking up seemed impossible. How could I interrupt to claim credit without appearing unprofessional or undermining Arnold's authority? The social dynamics of the situation made correction impossible, and I suspected Arnold understood that perfectly. After the meeting, Arnold found me in my office, his expression concerned and sympathetic. "You seem upset about something. Are you feeling okay?" The question was expertly crafted. It positioned my distress as a personal health issue rather than a legitimate professional concern. If I explained that I was upset about him taking credit for my work, I'd sound paranoid or jealous. If I said I was fine, I'd be accepting the dynamic that was systematically erasing my contributions. I just wish I could have provided context about the regulatory analysis, I said carefully. Some of the compliance requirements are more complex than they appeared in the presentation. Arnold nodded understandingly. "That's exactly why I thought it would be better for me to handle the board questions. You know how detailed your analysis gets. Board members prefer high-level strategic overview rather than getting lost in regulatory minutiae." Once again, my expertise was being reframed as a liability. My thorough understanding of complex regulations became getting lost in minutiae. My detailed analysis became excessive focus on irrelevant details. Arnold had successfully convinced me that my greatest professional strengths were actually weaknesses that needed to be managed. This pattern extended beyond major presentations to everyday interactions around the office. When colleagues sought strategic advice, they increasingly approached Arnold rather than coming directly to me. When external consultants visited to discuss market analysis methodologies, they met with Arnold while I handled coordination logistics. "Esme keeps everything organized perfectly," Arnold would explain to visitors, positioning me as his administrative support rather than the strategic expert they'd actually requested to meet. "She makes sure all the details are handled so I can focus on the big picture strategy work." I'd become the detail person while Arnold was the big picture thinker, despite the fact that strategic development required both analytical depth and broad conceptual thinking. My role was being systematically diminished through language that made my marginalization sound like efficient division of labor. The most insidious aspect was how Arnold made these changes seem like natural evolution rather than deliberate repositioning. He never explicitly stated that I was less capable or less important. Instead, he created situations where my diminished role appeared to be the logical result of organizational efficiency and my own personal preferences. "Esme prefers working behind the scenes," he'd explain when colleagues asked why I wasn't involved in high-profile presentations anymore. "She's more comfortable with detailed analysis than public speaking." These characterizations weren't entirely false. I did excel at detailed analysis, and I wasn't naturally drawn to public performance. But Arnold was using partial truths to create a complete fiction about my professional preferences and capabilities. My analytical strengths were being positioned as limitations that disqualified me from strategic leadership, rather than assets that enhanced it. 6 months after the Pacific Coast presentation, Harbor Industries announced its successful entry into Western markets, with revenues exceeding all projections. Arnold received a substantial bonus, and was featured in a manufacturing executive profile as an innovative strategic thinker who'd identified untapped market opportunities. The article included a photo of Arnold in his office, surrounded by charts and market analyses that I'd created, but that now appeared to be products of his individual genius. Reading the profile felt like watching someone else receive an award for my work, while I sat in the audience applauding politely. I was becoming a ghost in my own professional life, visible enough to handle supporting tasks, but invisible when recognition or advancement opportunities arose. And the most terrifying part was how gradually I'd accepted this transformation as normal, even inevitable. Arnold hadn't stolen my career through dramatic confrontation or obvious sabotage. Instead, he'd convinced me to give it away voluntarily, piece by piece, through 1,000 small concessions that individually seemed reasonable but collectively represented complete professional surrender. I was disappearing, and I'd been trained to believe it was my own choice. The revelation that Arnold's behavior wasn't isolated came during Harbor Industries' annual executive retreat at Lake Geneva. What I'd assumed was personal dynamic between my husband and me turned out to be part of a broader cultural pattern that extended far beyond our marriage. I first noticed it during the welcome cocktail reception when Arnold's colleague Sal introduced his wife Renee to a group of senior executives. Renee had an MBA from Wharton and had previously worked as a management consultant for Fortune 500 companies. But Sal's introduction focused entirely on her domestic accomplishments. "This is my wife Renee," Sal announced proudly. "She keeps our household running so efficiently that I never have to worry about anything at home. Frees me up to focus completely on work." Renee smiled graciously, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested this introduction wasn't her preference. When someone asked about her professional background, Sal answered before she could speak. "Oh, she used to work in consulting, but that was before we had kids. Now she's focused on more important things, making sure our family life supports my career advancement." The phrase "more important things" landed like a slap, reducing Renee's professional expertise to a secondary concern compared to her husband's career support. But what shocked me more was how naturally the other executives accepted this framing, as if highly educated women naturally evolved into support systems for their husbands' ambitions. Later that evening, I found myself in conversation with Isabel, the wife of Harbor's chief financial officer Patrick. Isabel had been a successful investment banker before marriage, with credentials that should have commanded respect in any professional setting. But when the conversation turned to Harbor's recent acquisition strategy, Patrick consistently redirected questions away from his wife. "Isabel has some interesting thoughts about market timing," Patrick said with an indulgent smile. "But you know how it is. She's been out of the industry for a few years now. Things change so quickly in finance." The dismissal was expertly crafted. Patrick acknowledged Isabel's expertise while simultaneously discrediting it, suggesting that her previous experience had somehow expired through disuse. Isabel didn't challenge the characterization, instead smiling diplomatically and changing the subject to safer topics. I began paying closer attention to similar interactions throughout the weekend, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every executive wife who'd had a significant career before marriage was now described primarily in terms of her support for her husband's professional success. Their previous achievements were mentioned briefly, if at all, before conversations shifted to their current roles as managers of domestic logistics. The most revealing moment came during Saturday's spouse activity, a wine tasting session while the executives attended strategic planning meetings. I'd assumed we were excluded from business discussions due to confidentiality concerns, but listening to conversations among the other wives revealed a different dynamic. "I used to attend the strategic sessions," Renee mentioned quietly while we sampled selections from local vineyards. "Back when Sal and I were both partners at our consulting firm, but once we married and I joined his company, he felt it created conflicts of interest." "Conflicts how?" I asked, genuinely curious about the reasoning. Renee exchanged glances with Isabel before continuing. Sal explained that clients might be confused about chain of command if they saw both of us in leadership roles. Better to have clear authority structures, he said. Less complicated for everyone involved. Isabel nodded knowingly. Patrick used almost identical language when he suggested I take a step back from client-facing roles. Cleaner lines of communication, he called it. I thought it made sense at the time. I felt a chill of recognition. Arnold had used similar phrases when explaining why I shouldn't co-present my own strategic analyses. Simpler communication, clearer authority, less confusion for board members. What I'd assumed was specific to our situation was apparently standard practice among Harbor's senior leadership. Do you ever miss it? I asked both women. The direct involvement in strategic decisions? Renee's laugh held no humor. You can't miss something you never really had control over. Looking back, I realized Sal was already positioning himself as the primary decision-maker while we were supposedly equal partners. Marriage just made the hierarchy official. The conversation continued, and I learned that every executive wife had experienced some version of the same gradual marginalization. Professional expertise redirected toward domestic support. Strategic insights filtered through husbands rather than presented directly. Career ambitions reframed as potential conflicts with family harmony. Most disturbing was how systematically this transformation had been accomplished. The men hadn't conspired deliberately. They'd simply absorbed and replicated patterns they'd observed in their own families and professional environments. Arnold's father had been a successful businessman whose wife managed household logistics so he could focus entirely on career advancement. Sal's mentor at their previous firm had operated similarly. Patrick's role models had all demonstrated that executive success required supportive spouses who prioritized career advancement over personal ambition. It's generational, Isabel explained over dinner that evening. Their father's generation had wives who didn't work outside the home, so supporting husbands' careers was their primary contribution. Our generation was supposed to be different, but somehow we ended up in similar roles despite having our own professional credentials. The realization was devastating. I'd been focused on understanding Arnold's individual behavior, but his actions were actually part of a broader cultural system that transformed accomplished women into support infrastructure for their husbands' success. The executives at Harbor Industries hadn't invented this dynamic. They'd inherited it from previous generations and modified it slightly to accommodate wives with professional backgrounds. The modification was crucial. Instead of explicitly demanding that wives abandon careers, the system encouraged gradual transition from independent professional identity to supportive domestic role. Women like me could maintain the fiction that we were choosing to step back, even as structural pressures made continued professional advancement increasingly difficult. Sunday morning brought the most illuminating conversation of the entire weekend. During breakfast, I overheard Arnold talking with Sal and Patrick about managing dual career dynamics in ways that supported executive advancement. The key is making sure they feel valued for their contributions, Arnold explained, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd successfully navigated complex personal logistics. Esme still handles all the detailed strategic analysis, but I present the recommendations to leadership. Keeps her engaged without creating confusion about decision-making authority. Sal nodded approvingly. Renee reviews all my presentation materials before important meetings. Her consulting background makes her excellent at catching logical gaps or weak arguments. But she understands that client relationships require consistent point of contact. Patrick added his own approach. Isabel manages all my financial modeling and market research. Honestly, she's better at quantitative analysis than most of our staff. But external stakeholders prefer dealing with a single executive rather than trying to navigate couple dynamics. They were describing their wives as unpaid consultants whose expertise enhanced their professional performance but remained invisible to external observers. We'd been converted into competitive advantages that our husbands could leverage without sharing credit or recognition. The conversation continued with discussion of how to maintain wives' engagement while ensuring their contributions didn't complicate professional relationships. The strategies were sophisticated and clearly effective. All three men had advanced rapidly within Harbor Industries, while their wives had gradually transitioned from independent professionals to behind-the-scenes support systems. What made the system particularly insidious was how it benefited from women's own competence and dedication. The more skilled we were at analysis and strategic thinking, the more valuable we became as invisible resources. Our professional training made us better at supporting our husbands' careers, but that same expertise was deemed inappropriate for direct professional application. Listening to their conversation, I finally understood that my situation wasn't the result of Arnold's individual shortcomings or our specific relationship dynamics. Instead, I'd been systematically incorporated into a well-established pattern that transformed accomplished women into competitive advantages for their husbands' careers. The retreat ended with renewed appreciation for how thoroughly I'd been absorbed into a system designed to maximize Arnold's professional success while minimizing my independent visibility. I wasn't just disappearing personally. I was participating in a cultural pattern that had successfully marginalized an entire generation of accomplished women. And the most terrifying realization was how completely I'd internalized the logic that made this arrangement seem natural, even beneficial. 4 years into our marriage, I'd become a ghost haunting my own professional life. The transformation was so complete that new employees at Harbor Industries had no idea I'd ever held an executive position, and longtime colleagues seemed to have collectively forgotten my strategic contributions to the company's most successful initiatives. My official title remained Executive Vice President of Strategic Development, but the role had been systematically hollowed out until it resembled administrative coordination more than strategic leadership. I arrived each morning to an office that felt like an elaborate theater set, impressive from the outside, but entirely without substance. The final erasure began with the International Markets Initiative, Harbor Industries' most ambitious expansion project in company history. The board had approved a $50 million investment to establish manufacturing partnerships across 3 continents, requiring exactly the kind of complex strategic analysis that had originally brought me to the company. Arnold announced the initiative during a Monday morning executive meeting that I learned about through his assistant's calendar reminder email. I wasn't invited to participate in planning discussions, despite international market expansion being precisely my area of expertise. "Congratulations on the International Markets Project," I mentioned to Arnold over dinner that evening. "It sounds like exactly the kind of strategic challenge you've been hoping for." He looked up from his phone with a pleased expression, apparently interpreting my comment as spousal admiration rather than professional interest. "Thanks, sweetheart. It's definitely the biggest project I've tackled. The complexity is incredible. Regulatory, frameworks, cultural considerations, partnership structures, really pushes the boundaries of strategic thinking." The irony was suffocating. Arnold was describing challenges that required skills I'd developed over 8 years at Goldman Sachs, expertise that Harbor Industries had specifically recruited when they offered me the Chief Strategy Officer position. But somehow, I'd become irrelevant to strategic initiatives that should have been my primary responsibility. "I'd love to contribute to the analysis," I offered carefully. "International market entry was my specialty at Goldman, and I've maintained contacts in several target regions." Arnold's expression shifted to gentle concern, the same look he might use when explaining why I shouldn't attempt complex home repairs. "Esme, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but this project requires deep industry knowledge and regulatory expertise. The board specifically requested that I handle it personally because of my operational background." The explanation was crafted to sound reasonable while being completely illogical. International expansion required strategic analysis far more than operational expertise, but Arnold had successfully convinced leadership that his skill set was more relevant than mine. My decade of experience in global markets had somehow become less valuable than his familiarity with domestic manufacturing processes. Maybe I could handle preliminary market research, I suggested, still hoping to contribute meaningful work rather than accepting complete exclusion. That's sweet of you to offer, Arnold replied, his tone suggesting that my proposal was endearing but impractical. But we've already contracted with McKinsey for comprehensive market analysis. Professional consulting firms have resources and methodologies that in-house analysis can't match. I felt physically sick listening to my husband explain why professional consultants were more qualified to provide the same expertise I'd been hired to deliver. Harbor Industries was paying external firms hundreds of thousands of dollars for analysis I could have produced more efficiently. But somehow my contributions had become so devalued that Arnold genuinely believed consultants were superior alternatives. The McKinsey team arrived 2 weeks later, 3 analysts in their late 20s who'd never worked in manufacturing, but whose prestigious firm credentials immediately commanded more respect than my years of industry experience. I watched from my increasingly irrelevant office as they conducted interviews with executives, reviewed financial projections, and developed recommendations that would shape Harbor's international future. When they requested background information about Harbor's strategic positioning, Arnold directed them to speak with me, not as a strategic expert, but as someone who could provide historical context and locate relevant documents. I'd become a corporate librarian, valuable only for my ability to retrieve information that others would analyze and interpret. Mrs. Mitchell has been with the company for several years, Arnold explained to the McKinsey team lead during their introductory meeting. She can help you navigate our internal systems and provide context about previous strategic initiatives. The introduction positioned me as institutional memory rather than strategic expertise, someone who could explain what had happened historically but couldn't contribute to future planning. The McKinsey analysts treated me politely, but clearly viewed me as administrative support rather than a professional peer. During their 3-month engagement, I provided the consultants with market research I'd conducted, competitive analyses I'd developed, and strategic frameworks I'd created over 4 years at Harbor Industries. They incorporated my work into their final recommendations without attribution, presenting insights I'd developed as their own professional conclusions. Arnold was thrilled with the McKinsey results, praising their analytical rigor and strategic sophistication during the board presentation. He never mentioned that many of their recommendations built directly on research I'd provided, or that their innovative market entry strategies closely resembled approaches I'd suggested months earlier. Outstanding work with the McKinsey team, Roberta commented after the board approved the international expansion plan. Arnold, your ability to leverage external expertise while maintaining strategic oversight was exactly what this project required. I sat in the back of the boardroom during the presentation, officially present as strategic development support, but functionally invisible to decision-makers who no longer recognized my expertise as relevant to their planning processes. The consulting recommendations that incorporated my research were attributed entirely to McKinsey's analytical capabilities, while Arnold received credit for effective consultant management. The most devastating moment came when one of the McKinsey analysts privately thanked me for my contributions to their work. "Your market research was incredibly thorough," she said quietly after the board presentation. "We couldn't have developed such comprehensive recommendations without your foundational analysis." She recognized the value of my work, but that recognition remained invisible to Harbor's leadership because it came from someone they viewed as my subordinate, rather than my professional equal. The consulting hierarchy had positioned me below, people with less experience and industry knowledge, making my expertise irrelevant regardless of its actual quality. After McKinsey departed, Arnold began implementing the international expansion strategy with enthusiasm that should have been infectious, but instead felt like watching someone else live my professional dreams. The project offered exactly the kind of complex strategic challenges I'd hoped to tackle when joining Harbor Industries, but I'd been systematically excluded from meaningful participation. "This is exactly why I moved from Goldman Sachs," I mentioned, to Arnold one evening as he worked late on expansion planning. "International market development was always my passion." He looked up from his laptop with genuine surprise, as if my previous career was some distant historical curiosity rather than directly relevant professional experience. "Really? I didn't realize you'd worked on international projects. That's interesting." His response revealed how completely my professional identity had been erased. Arnold genuinely couldn't connect my current invisible status with my previous expertise, because doing so would have required acknowledging that Harbor Industries was wasting valuable internal resources while paying premium rates for external consulting. I'd become so professionally invisible that my own husband had forgotten what I was actually qualified to do. The woman who'd once closed billion-dollar international mergers was now seen as someone whose enthusiasm for strategic projects was endearing but impractical, like a hobbyist's interest in professional activities she couldn't actually perform. Standing in our kitchen that evening, watching Arnold plan international expansion strategies without any recognition of my relevant expertise, I finally understood the depth of my professional erasure. I hadn't just been marginalized, I'd been made completely invisible, even to myself. The time for gradual recognition was over. If I was going to reclaim my professional identity, it would require something far more dramatic than hoping Arnold would eventually remember who I used to be. The moment that shattered my remaining illusions came during Harbor Industries' quarterly leadership dinner at the Union Club, where Arnold was being honored for his visionary leadership in expanding the company's international presence. I attended as his supportive spouse, wearing a navy dress he'd selected because it was appropriately elegant without being attention-seeking. The evening began predictably enough. I smiled graciously during cocktail hour while Arnold networked with board members and regional managers, occasionally being introduced as my wife Esme to executives who'd once sought my strategic advice directly. Nobody asked about my professional background or current role. I'd been so thoroughly repositioned as Arnold's domestic support that my business expertise had become invisible even to people who'd previously valued it. But the catalyst wasn't the familiar pattern of professional dismissal. It was something far more devastating. A conversation I overheard while retrieving Arnold's forgotten business cards from our car in the parking garage. I was returning through the service entrance when I heard Arnold's voice echoing from the private dining room where executives had gathered for cigars after dinner. The door was slightly ajar, and his words carried clearly through the marble hallway. "Honestly, gentlemen, the secret to managing a successful marriage while advancing your career is understanding that wives need to feel important without actually being involved in serious decision-making," Arnold was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone sharing professional wisdom. I froze in the hallway, business cards forgotten, as Arnold continued his explanation to an apparently receptive audience. Take Esme, for example. She has this fantasy that she understands international business because she used to work at Goldman Sachs, but that was years ago. The industry has evolved completely since then, so I let her review presentation materials and provide input, which keeps her engaged, but obviously I make the real strategic decisions. Patrick's voice joined the conversation. "How do you handle it when she pushes back on your approaches?" Arnold chuckled, the sound casual and confident. "The key is making her feel heard while ensuring she understands the complexity levels she's not equipped to handle. I'll say something like, 'That's an interesting perspective, honey, but you're missing the operational constraints that make it impractical.' She appreciates being consulted, and I avoid having to explain why her suggestions aren't workable." The business cards slipped from my trembling hands, scattering across the marble floor with sharp clicking sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence of my world collapsing. "The McKinsey project was perfect training for this," Arnold continued, apparently oblivious to the sound from the hallway. She provided background research, which made her feel contributing, while the real analysis was handled by professionals. Now she understands her appropriate role in strategic projects. Sal's voice added appreciation. That's brilliant management. Keeps them satisfied without complicating actual business operations. Exactly, Arnold agreed. And the best part is that she genuinely believes she's being helpful. It's not like I'm being deceptive. I just understand her limitations better than she does. Someone has to be the adult in the relationship when it comes to professional matters. I knelt slowly to collect the scattered business cards, each one feeling impossibly heavy as the full scope of Arnold's manipulation became clear. He wasn't unconsciously diminishing my contributions. He was deliberately managing me like a problematic employee who needed to be kept busy with meaningless tasks while real professionals handled important work. The conversation continued, but I could barely process the words through the roaring in my ears. 4 years of systematic professional erasure hadn't been gradual oversight or unconscious bias. Arnold had been executing a calculated strategy to transform me from strategic partner into manageable domestic accessory, and he was apparently proud enough of his methodology to share it as advice with colleagues. The wives with professional backgrounds are actually easier to manage, Arnold explained, warming to his theme. They understand business terminology, so you can give them projects that sound important while ensuring they never touch anything that actually matters. Esme spends hours on market research that I never use, but she feels valuable, and I get peace at home. I understood then that every strategic insight I'd provided, every analysis I'd spent weeks developing, every late night I'd worked on presentations, that Arnold claimed as his own. All of it had been nothing more than elaborate theater designed to keep me occupied while he pursued real professional advancement. The McKinsey consultants hadn't replaced my strategic expertise because Arnold valued external analysis more than internal resources. They'd been hired because Arnold had never intended to use my contributions for anything beyond managing my expectations about professional relevance. I'd been playing chess while Arnold was playing an entirely different game, one where my pieces were always decorative, never functional, and my strategic thinking was always background entertainment rather than actual decision-making input. Standing in that marble hallway, business cards finally collected, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who'd spent 4 years accepting explanations about operational complexity and professional development was disappearing, replaced by someone who finally understood the true nature of her situation. Arnold hadn't been unconsciously influenced by generational patterns or cultural expectations about executive marriages. He'd been implementing a deliberate strategy to neutralize a potential competitive threat, me, while extracting maximum benefit from my skills without sharing recognition or advancement opportunities. The most devastating realization was that I'd been completely complicit in my own professional assassination. Every time I'd accepted his explanations about complexity levels beyond my understanding, every time I'd prioritized harmony over accuracy, every time I'd chosen not to challenge his credit for my work, I'd been enabling a systematic campaign to erase my professional identity. But Arnold had made one crucial mistake in his management strategy. He'd underestimated exactly how much I understood about business operations, legal structures, and strategic positioning. The woman he'd been managing like a naive amateur was actually the same person who'd once restructured billion-dollar international mergers and identified market opportunities that transformed companies. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my appropriately elegant dress, and walked back into the Union Club with perfect composure. Arnold was accepting congratulations for his visionary international expansion leadership, beaming with pride at recognition for achievements that incorporated strategies I'd developed months before McKinsey had been engaged. "There you are, sweetheart," he said warmly when I rejoined the group. I was just telling everyone about the complexity of managing international partnerships. Fascinating strategic challenges. I smiled graciously, the same smile I'd perfected over 4 years of professional invisibility. It certainly sounds challenging, I agreed. I'm sure it requires exactly the kind of expertise you've developed. But internally, I was already calculating. Arnold had spent years positioning himself as the strategic visionary while converting me into unpaid research support. He'd built his professional reputation on work I'd contributed, while ensuring I remained invisible to decision-makers who might recognize my actual capabilities. Now it was time to demonstrate exactly what 4 years of systematic underestimation had cost him. The game was changing, and Arnold had no idea that the woman he'd been managing was about to become his most formidable competitor. The drive home from the Union Club passed in crystalline silence, while Arnold chatted enthusiastically about the evening's networking opportunities, completely unaware that I'd overheard his detailed explanation of how to manage wives with professional delusions. His voice seemed to come from a great distance as he described potential partnerships and expansion strategies, all built on foundation work I'd provided but would never be credited for completing. The Henderson Group seems genuinely interested in our European market approach, Arnold said, adjusting his rearview mirror while I stared out the passenger window at Chicago's skyline. They specifically mentioned being impressed by the strategic thinking behind our regulatory compliance framework. My regulatory compliance framework. Research I'd spent 3 months developing while Arnold focused on operational logistics. But correcting him seemed pointless now that I understood the deliberate nature of his credit appropriation. Instead, I smiled appropriately and made encouraging sounds while my mind began working through implications and possibilities. At home, Arnold headed directly to his office to follow up on some promising connections from tonight, leaving me alone in our kitchen with a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. The woman who'd spent 4 years accepting explanations about complexity beyond my understanding was gone, replaced by someone who finally saw the situation with professional objectivity rather than personal disappointment. I poured myself a glass of wine, not the cooking wine I'd been trained to drink, but the expensive Bordeaux Arnold saved for celebrating his professional achievements, and began systematically reviewing everything I thought I knew about our financial situation, Harbor Industries' corporate structure, and my own legal position. The first revelation came from our joint tax returns, which I retrieved from Arnold's locked filing cabinet using skills I'd forgotten I possessed from my investment banking days. Corporate executives often forgot that financial analysis included understanding how to access information that wasn't explicitly provided, and Arnold had never changed the combination on his office safe since our wedding. Our tax filings revealed assets I hadn't known existed. Harbor Industries stock options that Arnold had never mentioned. Investment accounts in his name that held significantly more than our joint savings. Most intriguingly, consulting income from firms I'd never heard of, payments that seemed oddly timed around major strategic initiatives I'd helped develop. But the real discovery was my own financial position, which proved far stronger than I'd realized. My Goldman Sachs retirement accounts had continued growing through intelligent investment choices I'd made years earlier. The suburban house we lived in was titled in both our names, representing significant equity I could access. Most importantly, my Harbor Industries stock options, granted during my original hiring, had vested completely and were worth substantially more than I'd calculated. Arnold had been managing our household finances in ways that minimized my awareness of my own financial independence. He'd convinced me we needed to be conservative with spending while apparently maintaining separate investment accounts that I'd never been told about. The woman he'd positioned as financially dependent was actually quite capable of supporting herself comfortably. The second revelation came from Harbor Industries' public filings, which I accessed through professional databases my Goldman Sachs credentials still provided access to. Reading through quarterly reports and SEC documentation, I discovered that Arnold's rapid advancement had coincided suspiciously with strategic initiatives that bore remarkable similarity to analysis I'd provided. The Pacific Coast expansion that had launched Arnold's promotion to senior vice president followed recommendations I'd outlined 6 months earlier. The regulatory compliance framework that board members praised for its innovative approach incorporated methodologies I'd developed during my international banking days. Even the McKinsey engagement had been structured around questions I'd identified as critical to successful market entry. Arnold hadn't just been taking credit for my work. He'd been systematically converting my strategic insights into career advancement opportunities while ensuring I remained invisible to the people who could recognize the source of his apparently brilliant thinking. But the most significant discovery was Harbor Industries' ownership structure, which revealed vulnerabilities Arnold apparently didn't realize existed. The company had grown rapidly through strategic acquisitions and partnerships, creating a complex web of subsidiary relationships and investment arrangements that would be difficult for someone without extensive merger and acquisition experience to navigate effectively. However, someone with my background could identify exactly where the leverage points were hidden. Harbor Industries was majority-owned by a private equity firm that specialized in manufacturing sector consolidation. The firm, Meridian Capital Partners, held 65% of voting shares through a complex arrangement that most Harbor executives probably didn't fully understand. But I recognized the structure immediately. It was identical to deals I'd analyzed dozens of times during my Goldman Sachs years. More importantly, Meridian Capital was currently seeking to exit their Harbor Industries investment as part of a broader portfolio restructuring. Public filings indicated they'd retained investment bankers to explore sale opportunities, but the process appeared to be in early stages with no definitive timeline established. This created an unprecedented opportunity for someone with the right expertise and sufficient capital to structure a competitive acquisition offer, the kind of opportunity that required exactly the combination of strategic analysis, financial modeling, and industry knowledge that I'd spent my entire career developing. Arnold had spent 4 years converting me into his invisible research department, while positioning himself as Harbor Industries' strategic visionary. But he'd made a critical error. He'd never actually developed the expertise he claimed to possess. His advancement had been built entirely on appropriating my analysis and presenting it as his own insight. If Harbor Industries faced a genuine strategic challenge that required independent thinking rather than stolen insights, Arnold would be completely unprepared to respond effectively. And a potential acquisition by unknown buyers definitely qualified as exactly that kind of challenge. I finished my wine and began making preliminary calculations about what it would take to structure a credible acquisition offer for Harbor Industries. The numbers were substantial but not impossible, particularly if I could identify financial partners who understood the company's actual value rather than its current market pricing. The irony was perfect. Arnold had spent years teaching me to minimize my own capabilities while simultaneously demonstrating that Harbor Industries' strategic success depended entirely on work he couldn't replicate independently. He'd created a situation where the company's most valuable strategic assets, my analytical frameworks and industry expertise, were completely invisible to current ownership. But invisible assets could become very visible very quickly if the right person knew how to illuminate them. I opened my laptop and began drafting emails to former Goldman Sachs colleagues who specialized in manufacturing sector acquisitions. Not specific proposals yet, just casual inquiries about market conditions and potential opportunities for strategic investment in undervalued manufacturing companies. Arnold thought he'd been managing me like a problematic employee who needed to be kept busy with meaningless projects. What he'd actually been doing was providing a masterclass in Harbor Industries' strategic vulnerabilities to someone uniquely qualified to exploit them. The student was about to become the teacher, and the lesson would be more expensive than Arnold could possibly imagine. The first email response came from Jonathan Marsh, my former Goldman Sachs colleague who'd transitioned to private equity after earning enough from investment banking to fund his own ventures. His message was intriguingly enthusiastic about manufacturing sector opportunities, particularly companies that were strategically undervalued due to market inefficiencies. Esme, wonderful to hear from you, his email read. I've been tracking Harbor Industries for months. Solid fundamentals, excellent growth trajectory, but trading at curious discount. Their strategic positioning suggests management with sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, but ownership structure indicates potential liquidity event approaching. Would love to discuss over coffee if you're exploring investment opportunities. Jonathan's insights revealed that Harbor Industries' success was visible to sophisticated investors who recognized strategic excellence even when they couldn't identify its source. Arnold's stolen strategies had transformed the company into an attractive acquisition target, but his own position was far more vulnerable than he realized. I arranged lunch with Jonathan at a downtown restaurant far from Harbor Industries' offices, claiming a dentist appointment to explain my afternoon absence. Arnold barely glanced up from his computer when I mentioned the errand, too focused on preparing for board meetings where he'd present analysis I'd developed months earlier. Harbor Industries is fascinating, Jonathan explained over expensive salads I could afford with my own vested stock options. Someone there has exceptional strategic insight, the kind of market positioning decisions that require both analytical depth and intuitive understanding of industry dynamics. But when I try to identify who's driving that thinking, the attribution becomes remarkably unclear. I nearly choked on my wine. What do you mean? Public communications suggest strategic direction comes from senior management, but the approaches are too sophisticated for typical operational executives. International expansion timing, regulatory compliance frameworks, market entry strategies. This level of strategic thinking usually comes from consultants or someone with investment banking background. Jonathan was describing my work without realizing it, recognizing analytical sophistication that Arnold could present, but never independently develop. The private equity community had noticed Harbor Industries' strategic excellence while remaining unable to identify its actual source. Hypothetically, I said carefully, what would it take to structure an acquisition offer for a company like Harbor? Jonathan's eyes sharpened with professional interest. Depends on the approach. Meridian Capital wants to exit within 18 months, probably seeking 8 to 10 times earnings based on recent comparable transactions. But the real question is whether acquiring management could maintain strategic momentum without whoever's currently driving analytical excellence. He was describing exactly the vulnerability I'd identified, Arnold's complete dependence on strategic work he couldn't replicate independently. Harbor Industries under his exclusive leadership would be far less valuable than Harbor Industries, with its current invisible analytical assets. What if the acquiring group included the person actually responsible for strategic analysis? I asked. Jonathan paused, clearly recognizing that our conversation had shifted from hypothetical discussion to actual opportunity exploration. That would change everything. Acquisition financing becomes much more accessible when investors can verify that strategic assets will be retained. Are we talking about a management buyout scenario? I spent the next hour explaining my situation without directly naming Arnold or revealing the extent of his strategic appropriation. Jonathan listened with growing fascination as I outlined how Harbor Industries' most successful initiatives had been developed by someone who remained invisible to current ownership and market analysts. This is remarkable, he said finally. You're describing a company whose strategic value is entirely concentrated in an individual who has no formal recognition or equity participation. That represents both unprecedented opportunity and substantial risk for current ownership. Jonathan agreed to conduct preliminary valuation analysis based on Harbor Industries' public information, with the understanding that detailed financial modeling would require access to internal data I could potentially provide. He also offered to introduce me to investors who specialized in management buyout financing for manufacturing companies. Driving home, I felt the exhilaration of finally applying my professional expertise to a challenge worthy of my capabilities. For 4 years, Arnold had kept me occupied with background research while handling all strategic decision-making. Now I was developing a transaction that would require every skill I'd developed during my Goldman Sachs career. That evening, Arnold came home excited about Harbor Industries' strong quarterly results and his growing reputation for strategic innovation. He described board conversations where his market insights had been praised as revolutionary thinking that positions Harbor ahead of industry trends. "It's incredible how everything seems to be falling into place," he said over dinner. "The international expansion, regulatory compliance frameworks, market positioning strategies, all the pieces are aligning perfectly." I smiled and congratulated him on his success, internally calculating how much Harbor Industries' strategic value would decline once its invisible analytical assets were no longer available to support his presentations. Arnold had taught me to minimize my own contributions while maximizing his professional advancement, but he'd also inadvertently provided me with comprehensive understanding of Harbor Industries' strategic vulnerabilities and operational dependencies. The company he thought he controlled was about to discover exactly what happened when its most valuable assets disappeared overnight. And Arnold was about to learn the true cost of systematically underestimating the woman who'd been providing his strategic intelligence for 4 years. 2 weeks after my lunch with Jonathan, I was sitting in the downtown offices of Peterson, Walsh & Associates, the most prestigious business law firm in Chicago, consulting with Renee Patterson about the legal complexities of structuring a management buyout while married to a senior executive at the target company. Renee had been a Harvard Law School classmate of my Goldman Sachs mentor, and her specialty was exactly the kind of complex corporate transaction I was contemplating. Her corner office overlooked Lake Michigan, and her wall displayed certificates recognizing her expertise in mergers and acquisitions law that rivaled my own understanding of the financial structures. "This is one of the most fascinating cases I've encountered," Renee said, reviewing the preliminary analysis Jonathan had prepared about Harbor Industries' valuation and ownership structure. "You're essentially proposing to acquire a company where you've been providing invisible strategic value while your husband has been receiving recognition for your contributions." I'd explained my situation carefully, focusing on professional dynamics rather than personal grievances. Renee understood immediately that this represented both unprecedented opportunity and substantial legal complexity requiring sophisticated planning. "The key issue is ensuring that any acquisition attempt doesn't create conflicts of interest or fiduciary duty violations," she continued. "You're currently an employee with access to strategic information that could provide unfair advantage in competitive bidding processes." But Renee had identified a solution that was both legally sound and strategically brilliant. If I resigned from Harbor Industries before initiating acquisition discussions, I would eliminate conflict of interest concerns while simultaneously creating a crisis for Arnold, who depended entirely on my analytical capabilities, but had never acknowledged that dependence publicly. "Your resignation would force Harbor Industries to demonstrate whether their strategic capabilities are sustainable without your contributions," Renee explained. "If Arnold can maintain strategic excellence independently, that strengthens the company's value. If he can't, it reveals fundamental vulnerabilities that justify lower acquisition pricing." The plan she outlined was elegantly simple. Resign from Harbor Industries citing desire to return to investment banking, then approach Meridian Capital Partners with an acquisition proposal that highlighted my expertise in manufacturing sector analysis. My departure would either prove Arnold's independent capabilities or expose his dependence on work he'd been claiming as his own. "How quickly could we structure a credible offer?" I asked. "Jonathan's preliminary financials suggest Harbor Industries is worth approximately $120 million at current market rates. With your strategic expertise retained and properly valued, acquisition financing should be readily available through private equity partners who understand manufacturing sector dynamics." Renee introduced me to Sandra Kim, a financial advisor who specialized in executive buyout transactions. Sandra reviewed my personal financial position and confirmed that I had sufficient assets to participate meaningfully in acquisition financing, particularly with institutional investors who valued strategic continuity. Your Goldman Sachs background provides credibility that most management buyout candidates lack, Sandra explained during our initial consultation. Investors understand that someone with your experience can identify value creation opportunities that current management might miss. Over the following week, I began documenting every strategic contribution I'd made to Harbor Industries over 4 years, creating a comprehensive portfolio that demonstrated my responsibility for the company's most successful initiatives. The documentation revealed a pattern that even I hadn't fully recognized. Every major strategic success could be traced directly to analysis I'd provided. The Pacific Coast expansion, international market entry, regulatory compliance frameworks, partnership, development strategies, all of it originated from work I'd done while Arnold handled presentation and implementation. Harbor Industries' strategic value was built entirely on capabilities that would disappear the moment I was no longer available to provide analytical support. But I also began preparing for Arnold's inevitable response to my resignation. He would need to replace my strategic contributions immediately, or risk exposing his dependence on work he'd been claiming as his own. That created an opportunity to observe whether he could independently maintain the analytical sophistication that had built his professional reputation. Drafted my resignation letter on a Tuesday evening, while Arnold worked late preparing for a board presentation about European market opportunities. A presentation built entirely on research I'd conducted, but that he would deliver as evidence of his strategic insight. Effective in 2 weeks, I will be resigning from my position as Executive Vice President of Strategic Development to pursue opportunities in investment banking that better utilize my analytical background, the letter stated simply. No explanations about marriage difficulties or personal conflicts, just professional repositioning that no one could reasonably object to. The letter would land like a controlled explosion in Arnold's carefully constructed professional identity. For 4 years, he'd positioned himself as Harbor Industries' strategic visionary, while ensuring I remained invisible to people who might recognize the true source of his insights. Now, he would have exactly 2 weeks to prove that his strategic capabilities were authentic rather than appropriated. I sealed the resignation letter and placed it in my briefcase, ready to deliver the next morning. Arnold was about to discover what happened when his invisible strategic department suddenly became unavailable, and Harbor Industries was about to learn the true source of their competitive advantages. The woman they'd systematically underestimated was finally ready to demonstrate exactly what 4 years of strategic thinking could accomplish when properly applied to her own professional objectives. My resignation letter triggered exactly the crisis I'd anticipated, but Arnold's response revealed vulnerabilities even more severe than I'd calculated. Within hours of receiving my notice, he was desperately attempting to convince me that leaving Harbor Industries would be a catastrophic career mistake. "Esme, this is completely irrational," he said over dinner the night after I'd submitted my resignation. "You have an excellent position here, security, recognition. Why would you throw that away to return to the uncertainty of investment banking?" The irony was suffocating. Arnold was describing job security and recognition that existed only in his imagination, since I'd been systematically marginalized for 4 years while he'd claimed credit for my strategic contributions. But his panic suggested that he understood exactly what my departure would cost him professionally. "I miss the analytical challenges," I replied calmly. "Harbor Industries has been a wonderful experience, but I'm ready for more complex strategic work." Arnold's expression shifted to something approaching desperation. "What if we restructured your role here? More direct involvement in strategic planning, co-presentation opportunities, increased visibility with board members?" He was offering everything he'd spent years denying me: but only because my departure threatened to expose his complete dependence on work he couldn't replicate independently. The timing made his motivations transparent to anyone paying attention. Meanwhile, I was systematically building the coalition necessary for a successful acquisition attempt. Jonathan had introduced me to Marcus Chen, a private equity partner, whose firm specialized in manufacturing sector buyouts. Marcus was immediately intrigued by the possibility of acquiring a company with proven strategic excellence at below-market valuation. Harbor Industries represents exactly the kind of opportunity we seek, Marcus explained during our confidential meeting at his firm's offices. Strong operational fundamentals, excellent market positioning, but trading at discount due to ownership. Transition requirements. If we can retain strategic capabilities during acquisition, the value creation potential is extraordinary. Marcus confirmed that his firm could provide 60% of acquisition financing if I could demonstrate continued access to the strategic expertise that had driven Harbor Industries' recent success. Since I was the source of that expertise, retaining it would be automatically guaranteed once I had controlling ownership interest. But the most valuable ally came from an unexpected source. Isabel Morrison, Patrick's wife from the Lake Geneva retreat. She contacted me through LinkedIn after hearing rumors about my resignation, requesting a confidential coffee meeting to discuss mutual professional interests. "I've been watching your situation for years," Isabel said during our meeting at a discreet downtown cafe. "What Arnold has been doing to you is exactly what Patrick did to me, systematically appropriating strategic insights while ensuring the originator remains invisible." Isabel revealed that she'd been documenting her own husband's pattern of credit appropriation, building a comprehensive record of strategic contributions that Patrick had claimed as his independent work. More importantly, she'd been quietly rebuilding her professional network and exploring opportunities to reclaim her career in financial analysis. "Harbor Industries is more vulnerable than most people realize," she continued. "Patrick's been struggling with strategic analysis ever since the McKinsey project ended. He's been calling external consultants for guidance on decisions that should be routine for someone with his supposed expertise. This intelligence was invaluable. If both Arnold and Patrick were experiencing strategic difficulties without their wives' invisible support, Harbor Industries might be facing a broader leadership crisis that would justify acquisition at even lower valuations than Jonathan had calculated. Isabel also introduced me to Dr. Sandra Walsh, a business professor at Northwestern who specialized in gender dynamics in corporate leadership. Sandra had been researching exactly the phenomenon that Isabel and I had experienced: highly qualified women being systematically converted into invisible support systems for their husband's career advancement. "Your situation represents a perfect case study in strategic asset misallocation," Sandra explained. "Harbor Industries has been undervaluing their most sophisticated analytical capabilities while overcompensating executives who contribute primarily implementation skills." Sandra offered to provide expert testimony about the economic value of strategic expertise in manufacturing sector companies, documentation that would be crucial for justifying acquisition financing and post-transaction management structures. But my most surprising ally was David Harrison, Harbor Industries' former board member who'd resigned 6 months earlier, citing concerns about strategic direction and leadership transparency. David had been quietly investigating Harbor's management practices after noticing inconsistencies between strategic presentation quality and executives' apparent analytical capabilities. "I've suspected for some time that Harbor's strategic excellence originated from sources that weren't being properly recognized or compensated," David told me during a discreet lunch meeting. "Your resignation confirms my concerns about leadership sustainability." David revealed that Meridian Capital Partners had been increasingly worried about management depth at Harbor Industries, particularly given the sophisticated strategic thinking required for continued international expansion. If key strategic capabilities were concentrated in individuals who lacked appropriate recognition or equity participation, that represented significant risk for potential acquirers. Meridian would be very interested in acquisition proposals that demonstrate retention of proven strategic assets, David confirmed, particularly if those assets could be properly valued and incentivized under new ownership structures. By the end of 2 weeks, I'd assembled a coalition that included private equity financing, legal expertise, strategic documentation, and insider intelligence about Harbor Industries' actual vulnerabilities. Arnold's desperate attempts to retain me had only confirmed that his professional reputation depended entirely on access to strategic capabilities he couldn't replace. The woman he'd been managing like a naive amateur had quietly built the foundation for acquiring the company where he thought his position was secure. Arnold was about to discover that underestimating someone for 4 years provided them with comprehensive understanding of exactly where all the weaknesses were hidden. The final pieces of my acquisition strategy crystallized during my last week at Harbor Industries, as Arnold's increasing desperation revealed the full extent of his strategic dependence. He'd been requesting transition meetings to ensure continuity of analytical frameworks, essentially asking me to train him in methodologies I'd been using for 4 years while he claimed credit for the results. "I want to make sure we don't lose institutional knowledge when you leave," Arnold explained during one particularly revealing conversation in his office. "Could you document your analytical approaches for strategic planning processes?" The request was breathtaking in its implications. Arnold was asking me to create training materials for capabilities he'd supposedly developed independently, essentially admitting that he'd never actually understood the strategic thinking he'd been presenting as his own innovation. "Of course," I replied with perfectly professional courtesy. "I'll prepare comprehensive documentation of all methodologies and frameworks." But the documentation I prepared was strategically selective, including enough information to appear thorough, while omitting critical analytical components that couldn't be easily replicated without extensive experience. Arnold would receive materials that looked comprehensive, but would prove inadequate for independent strategic development. Meanwhile, Marcus Chen's private equity firm had completed their preliminary due diligence on Harbor Industries, confirming that my departure had created exactly the acquisition opportunity we'd anticipated. The company's strategic value was entirely dependent on capabilities that would disappear unless properly retained through new ownership structures. Meridian Capital is increasingly motivated to accelerate their exit timeline, Marcus reported, during our final planning meeting. "Your resignation has raised questions about management sustainability that they're eager to resolve through sale completion. The acquisition financing was now fully committed at $95 million, substantially below previous valuations, but reflecting realistic assessment of Harbor Industries' worth without its invisible strategic assets. Marcus's firm would provide primary financing while I contributed personal investment that would establish my controlling ownership position. But the most crucial preparation involved timing the acquisition announcement for maximum strategic impact. Renee Patterson had identified that Harbor Industries' annual shareholder meeting was scheduled for the following month, providing the perfect venue for Meridian Capital to announce acceptance of our acquisition offer. "Arnold will be presenting annual strategic review at that meeting," Renee explained. "If our acquisition is announced immediately afterward, it will create maximum contrast between his claims about future strategic direction and the reality of new ownership with demonstrated strategic expertise." I spent my final days at Harbor Industries completing one last strategic analysis that Arnold would never see, a comprehensive assessment of the company's competitive vulnerabilities under his exclusive leadership. The analysis revealed that Harbor's apparent strategic sophistication was entirely superficial, built on frameworks Arnold could present but never modify or adapt to changing market conditions. Without access to genuine strategic thinking, Harbor Industries would quickly lose competitive advantages that had taken years to develop. Arnold's presentations were professionally polished, but they reflected static understanding rather than dynamic analytical capabilities required for continued market leadership. The divorce proceedings had also reached final stages, with settlement, terms that gave me substantial equity in jointly held assets, while ensuring Arnold couldn't claim any interest in my independent investment activities. Renee had structured the legal arrangements to completely separate my acquisition activities from marital assets, protecting both my strategic plans and Arnold's remaining financial security. He'll retain the house and his Harbor Industries compensation through the transition period, Renee confirmed. But your acquisition activities are entirely independent of marital property, eliminating any potential conflicts or claims. On my final Thursday at Harbor Industries, I attended one last executive meeting where Arnold presented quarterly strategic review materials I'd prepared months earlier. Watching him deliver my analysis as evidence of his strategic insight felt like observing an actor performing a role he'd never fully understood. The European market expansion continues exceeding projections, Arnold announced confidently, referencing financial models I'd developed the previous summer. Our regulatory compliance frameworks have positioned Harbor Industries ahead of competitive threats in 3 key sectors. Board members praised his strategic foresight and analytical sophistication, completely unaware that they were witnessing the final performance of a 4-year strategic theater production. Arnold basked in recognition for capabilities he would lose access to within days. After the meeting, I cleaned out my office with the same methodical efficiency I'd applied to strategic analysis throughout my tenure at Harbor Industries. 4 years of work reduced to a single box of personal items and professional awards that Arnold had never understood the significance of achieving. "I still think you're making a mistake," Arnold said, stopping by as I packed the last items from my desk. "Harbor Industries has been good to you. You've built something valuable here." I looked around the office that had gradually been stripped of meaningful responsibilities until it resembled expensive storage space more than strategic headquarters. "Yes," I agreed. "I have built something valuable here." Arnold smiled, apparently interpreting my response as sentimental attachment to the company rather than quiet satisfaction about assets I was preparing to acquire. The next morning, I would wake up as a private citizen with no obligations to Harbor Industries, free to pursue investment opportunities that my professional expertise suggested represented exceptional value. Arnold would wake up as the company's primary strategic executive, finally holding the independent authority he'd claimed to possess for 4 years. We would both discover very quickly which of us had actually been providing Harbor Industries competitive advantages. 3 weeks after my resignation from Harbor Industries, Marcus Chen and I walked into Meridian Capital Partners' downtown offices to present our formal acquisition proposal. The timing was perfect. Arnold had just completed his first major strategic presentation without my analytical support, and the results had been catastrophically revealing. Harbor Industries' quarterly review raised significant concerns about strategic leadership depth, confirmed Rebecca Stone, Meridian's managing partner, as she reviewed our acquisition materials. The presentation lacked the analytical sophistication we've come to expect from their management team. I maintained professionally neutral expression while internally celebrating. Arnold's first independent performance had apparently been as superficial as I'd predicted, lacking the strategic insight that board members had praised when he was presenting my analysis as his own thinking. "Our proposal addresses those leadership concerns directly," Marcus explained, outlining the acquisition structure we'd developed. Ms. Richardson's strategic expertise represents exactly the analytical capabilities Harbor Industries requires for continued competitive success. Rebecca studied my professional background with obvious interest. The Goldman Sachs credentials, manufacturing sector experience, and documented strategic contributions to Harbor's most successful initiatives created a compelling narrative about management continuity under new ownership. "This is fascinating," Rebecca said after reviewing the comprehensive portfolio I'd assembled. "You're proposing to acquire a company where you previously provided invisible strategic value, essentially bringing those assets under proper ownership and compensation structures." The acquisition offer was $95 million, representing 15% below current market valuations, but reflecting realistic assessment of Harbor Industries' prospects without sustainable strategic leadership. Marcus had structured the financing to complete within 60 days, allowing Meridian to exit their investment ahead of their original timeline. But Rebecca wanted verification that our assessment of Harbor's strategic vulnerabilities was accurate. Rather than personal bias from a disgruntled former employee, she arranged for independent consultants to evaluate Harbor Industries' recent strategic decision-making and leadership effectiveness. If your analysis is correct about strategic capability gaps, that will justify the acquisition pricing, Rebecca explained. If Harbor's management can demonstrate independent strategic excellence, we might expect higher offers from other potential buyers. The next 2 weeks provided exactly the verification Rebecca had requested. Harbor Industries struggled visibly with strategic challenges that should have been routine for executives with Arnold's supposed expertise. A potential partnership with a European manufacturer stalled due to regulatory analysis that Arnold couldn't complete independently. Market expansion plans for the Southeast region were delayed indefinitely while Arnold contracted with external consultants for strategic guidance he'd previously claimed to provide internally. Most damaging was Arnold's response to a competitive threat from overseas manufacturers who were entering Harbor's primary markets with innovative pricing strategies. Instead of developing competitive responses using frameworks I'd established, Arnold scheduled multiple meetings with McKinsey consultants while Harbor Industries lost market share to more agile competitors. Harbor's strategic response time has increased dramatically, confirmed David Harrison, who maintained informal communication with several board members despite his resignation. Decisions that previously required days now take weeks, while management seeks external guidance for analysis they use to provide independently. The independent consultants Rebecca had engaged reached identical conclusions. Harbor Industries had been operating with strategic capabilities that were no longer available, creating leadership gaps that threatened the company's competitive position in rapidly evolving markets. Management appears to have been dependent on analytical resources that are no longer accessible, the consulting report concluded. Strategic decision-making has slowed significantly, and the sophistication of market analysis has declined substantially since recent personnel changes. Meanwhile, Arnold was becoming increasingly desperate about his deteriorating professional situation. He'd called me several times requesting consultation on strategic projects, offering substantial fees for analytical work he'd never paid for during our marriage. "I'm working on some complex market analysis that could benefit from your perspective," he'd said during one particularly revealing phone call. "Harbor Industries would be willing to engage you as an external consultant for strategic planning projects." The offer was both pathetic and illuminating. Arnold was essentially asking to purchase the same analytical capabilities he'd been claiming as his own expertise, apparently unaware that I was already applying those capabilities to acquiring his company. But the most satisfying confirmation came from Isabel Morrison, who reported that Patrick was experiencing similar strategic difficulties after her own departure from informal advisory roles. Harbor Industries was facing a broader leadership crisis, as multiple executives struggled with analytical challenges they'd previously handled through invisible support from their systematically marginalized wives. The entire senior management team is floundering, Isabel reported during one of our confidential update meetings. Patrick's been calling management consulting firms for guidance on decisions he used to make confidently. Sal's postponed 3 major client presentations because he can't replicate analytical frameworks Renee used to provide. Harbor Industries was imploding exactly as I'd predicted, revealing that its apparent strategic excellence had been built on capabilities that were never properly recognized or compensated. The company Arnold thought he controlled was discovering that its most valuable assets had been invisible and were now completely unavailable. Meridian Capital Partners accepted our acquisition offer on a Tuesday morning, with completion scheduled for Harbor Industries' annual shareholder meeting the following week. Arnold would spend the next 7 days believing he was preparing to present Harbor's strategic vision for the coming year. He had no idea he was actually preparing to transfer ownership to the woman he'd been systematically underestimating for 4 years. Harbor Industries' annual shareholder meeting was scheduled for 6 p.m. at the Grand Meridian Hotel, the same venue where Arnold had dismissed me as just a housewife 6 months earlier. The symmetry was so perfect, I wondered if the universe had a sense of dramatic irony. I arrived early, wearing the same navy dress Arnold had once criticized for being attention-seeking, now paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother had left me, armor for the battle I'd been preparing for months. Marcus Chen accompanied me, carrying the legal documents that would transfer Harbor Industries' ownership to our investment group within the hour. Arnold was already in the ballroom, networking confidently with shareholders and board members, completely unaware that Meridian Capital had accepted an acquisition offer from the woman he'd spent years managing like a problematic employee. He'd prepared extensively for this presentation, apparently believing it would showcase his strategic leadership and secure his position for years to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arnold began as the meeting officially commenced, "Harbor Industries has achieved unprecedented growth through innovative strategic thinking and operational excellence that positions us perfectly for continued expansion." I sat in the back of the ballroom, officially present as Marcus's strategic advisor for the acquiring investment group, watching Arnold present quarterly results that reflected the final months of strategies I'd developed before my resignation. His confidence was impressive, but I could see the subtle signs of someone performing beyond his actual capabilities. "Our European market expansion exceeded all projections," Arnold continued, demonstrating the sophisticated analytical frameworks that guide our international development strategies. The irony was exquisite. Arnold was describing analytical frameworks I'd created while simultaneously preparing to lose ownership of the company to the person who'd actually developed those capabilities. He was marketing my expertise to shareholders who were about to discover that those assets belonged to someone else entirely. 20 minutes into Arnold's presentation, Rebecca Stone approached the podium with an expression that immediately shifted the room's energy. As Meridian Capital's managing partner, her presence commanded attention from every shareholder present. "Before we proceed with strategic planning discussions," Rebecca announced, "Meridian Capital Partners has an important ownership transition to announce." Arnold's confident expression flickered momentarily, but he stepped aside graciously, apparently assuming Rebecca would deliver routine updates about Meridian's continued investment in Harbor Industries. Effective immediately, Meridian Capital has completed the sale of our majority stake in Harbor Industries to Richardson Strategic Partners, led by Ms. Esme Richardson, former Goldman Sachs Vice President and Harbor Industries former Executive Vice President of Strategic Development. The ballroom fell silent as 200 shareholders processed the implications of Rebecca's announcement. Arnold's face went completely white as he realized that the woman he'd been systematically marginalizing had just acquired controlling ownership of the company where he thought his position was secure. I stood from my seat in the back of the room and walked toward the podium with the same measured confidence I'd once used during billion-dollar merger presentations. The navy dress that Arnold had once deemed attention-seeking suddenly felt perfectly appropriate for claiming ownership of a $95 million manufacturing company. "Thank you, Rebecca," I said, accepting the microphone with hands that were completely steady. "I'm pleased to announce that Harbor Industries will continue operating under new ownership structures that properly recognize and compensate the strategic capabilities that have driven the company's recent success." Arnold remained frozen beside the podium, apparently unable to process that his carefully managed wife had just revealed herself as his new boss. The shareholders who'd applauded his strategic presentations were now staring at the woman who'd actually provided the analytical expertise he'd been claiming as his own. "The transition will be seamless," I continued, "because Richardson Strategic Partners brings extensive experience with the manufacturing sector and intimate familiarity with Harbor Industries' operational requirements and competitive positioning. Patrick Kellerman, the regional manager who'd witnessed my original confrontation with Arnold, began clapping slowly, the same way he had 6 months earlier when I'd revealed the divorce and Arnold's impending removal from executive leadership. This time, the applause built into something thunderous as shareholders recognized that Harbor Industries' strategic assets would remain intact under ownership that could actually replicate and improve upon the analytical excellence they'd come to expect. But the most satisfying moment came when I looked directly at Arnold and delivered the line I'd been planning for months. Mr. Mitchell will be transitioning to a consulting role that better utilizes his operational expertise while strategic leadership returns to someone with appropriate qualifications for that responsibility. Arnold choked on nothing, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally dawning horror as he realized that the woman he'd managed like a naive amateur had quietly acquired the company he'd assumed would always be his domain. The perfect little housewife had just claimed ownership of everything he thought he controlled. 6 months after acquiring Harbor Industries, I stood in my corner office, the same space where Arnold had once held strategy meetings that excluded me, reviewing quarterly reports that showed 37% revenue growth under new ownership. The company hadn't just survived the leadership transition. It was thriving in ways that had never been possible while its strategic assets remained invisible and undervalued. My first actions as CEO had focused on recognizing capabilities that previous management had systematically overlooked. Isabel Morrison joined as Chief Financial Officer, bringing analytical expertise that Patrick had been appropriating for years. Dr. Sandra Walsh became Strategic Development Director, applying academic research about gender dynamics to create corporate structures that properly valued diverse analytical approaches. Arnold had accepted a consulting position with our primary competitor, apparently telling colleagues that he'd chosen to leave Harbor Industries to pursue new challenges in a more entrepreneurial environment. The story allowed him to preserve some professional dignity, while acknowledging that his role at Harbor had become untenable under new ownership structures. But the most meaningful transformation was personal. The woman who'd spent 4 years accepting explanations about complexity beyond her understanding had become the CEO of a manufacturing company that industry publications now described as strategically innovative and analytically sophisticated. "Your turnaround strategy has been remarkable," commented Jonathan Marsh during our quarterly investor review. "Harbor Industries under your leadership demonstrates exactly the kind of value creation we hoped to achieve through this acquisition." The success wasn't mysterious. I'd simply applied the same analytical capabilities to corporate leadership that I'd previously provided as invisible support for Arnold's presentations. The difference was that strategic insights now received proper attribution and implementation, creating sustainable competitive advantages rather than temporary performance improvements. Last month, Manufacturing Executive featured Harbor Industries on their cover with the headline, "Strategic Renaissance: How Proper Leadership Recognition Drives Corporate Excellence." The accompanying article highlighted our acquisition as a model for identifying undervalued strategic assets in traditional manufacturing companies. Arnold called last week, ostensibly to congratulate me on the magazine profile, but actually requesting a reference letter for a consulting opportunity he was pursuing. The conversation was awkward, but cordial. 2 former colleagues discussing professional matters with the careful politeness of people who understood their respective positions clearly. "You've certainly exceeded everyone's expectations," he said, his voice carrying grudging respect that hadn't been present during our marriage. "Harbor Industries is fortunate to have someone with your strategic expertise leading the company." The acknowledgement came 4 years too late to repair our relationship, but it confirmed that Arnold finally understood what he'd been systematically underestimating throughout our marriage. The woman he'd managed like a problematic employee was exactly the strategic leader Harbor Industries had needed all along. I thanked him graciously and promised to provide the reference letter he'd requested. Professional courtesy seemed appropriate between former colleagues, even when those colleagues had once been married and had navigated complex power dynamics that nearly destroyed one person's career while advancing the other's. Hanging up the phone, I turned back to the strategic planning documents spread across my desk. Analysis for Harbor Industries' expansion into renewable energy manufacturing, a sector that offered exactly the kind of complex challenges I'd always hoped to tackle professionally. The housewife who'd once served coffee while being dismissed as decorative background was now developing strategies that would position Harbor Industries as a leader in emerging industrial markets. And for the first time in years, the recognition for that strategic thinking would go exactly where it belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.